we are back with another episode of Gladio Free Europe. I'm Russian Sam, and I'm joined by my co-host Liam.
Hi! Well, thank you so much, Sam, for putting this amazing episode together, and also for animating it to life with those magical words you have placed inside our recording devices.
Well, we actually live in the world of the creatures we're going to be talking about today. It's Halloween coming up right around the corner, and so to celebrate that great holiday, we decided that we're going to talk about one of the greatest archetypical characters in Jewish folklore and greater cinema writ large, which continues to loom over us well into our times.
That's right. This episode is going to be mostly focused on the 1920 film The Golem, how he came into the world, directed by Paul Wegener, but is also going to kind of touch on the broader Golem story. Why this early 20th century Christian filmmaker was so interested in this story, and how this Golem legend came to be so popular. And by the end of the episode, I think all of us are going to understand why we might just be living in the true age of the Golem today.
But before we begin this week's episode, I would just like to kindly remind you to leave us a review on Spotify, iTunes, tell your friends about us, etc. It really does help us a lot when you guys
tell your dog, tell your grandma.
Tell your golem.
Yes! All right, and I think that's as good a place as any to dive in.
Oh, yeah. So before we begin, we'd just like to note that if you've been listening to Gladio Free Europe for a while, you're already familiar with this cast of characters.
Yes.
We have Paul Wegener, who plays the iconic Golem in this movie. It's probably his greatest role. And people who have been listening to Gladio Free Europe for a while may recognize Heinrich Galeen, who would later go on to write the script for Nosferatu, which we talked about in episode 22. And both of these guys were quite involved in Weimar cinema, which Liam and Abram got into quite a bit in episode 38 about M.
Right, yeah, I believe this is our third time around talking about this, very beloved little moment in film history.
Well, it's probably the greatest moment in film history, bar none. These guys were coming up with techniques and styles that would continue to be used to this day, to the point where they're now cliches. But back then, these weren't cliches. This was highly original. These guys were on the cutting edge.
Totally. And I would say if you got to see one Weimar movie, you should see Nosferatu. But if you're going to see two, I think you could do a lot worse than your second one being The Golem, because this is a really cool movie. It's just visually, it's beautiful. It's got a pretty cool story, and it does kind of, make you think a little bit about the nature of humanity.
Yeah, so the setting for the movie is Prague, which is a very beautiful city. I would recommend going there if you have the time someday. But it's interesting because Paul Wegener would in fact make his film acting debut in 1913 with The Student of Prague, which was one of the first horror movies as we would know it today.
Right, yeah. I think we actually mentioned The Student of Prague briefly in the Nosferatu episode, because that was not only was it the first horror movie, some people would even call it the first art movie, and that a lot of the people involved in that, including Wegener, they sort of use these techniques, including the use of special effects to tell a moralistic supernatural story. They would do that again with many movies, basically throughout the later history of cinema. There's a lot of talk now about elevated horror, which I think is a very obnoxious phrase. But if you want to blame somebody for that, maybe you can blame Paul Wegener for kind of inventing it with The Student of Prague.
Yeah, and speaking of horror, these guys clearly had a different definition of scary than we do these days. So I gotta ask you, Liam, when you were watching the Golem, were you shivering? Were you quaking in your boots?
All right, I'll admit that it might not be as scary today as it was 102 years ago when it came out. But I will say that it is definitely a very compelling movie, and that even if some of the effects don't really seem scary today, they're certainly really impressive. And a lot of the imagery is just really, really cool. It's a real visual treat, and Russian Sam, you found that there is a really great new restoration that's free on YouTube. You could say it's a much prettier movie to watch today than it would have been a few years ago before this restoration.
Yeah, they also redid the soundtrack. They restored some title cards which had been missing. It's great. We're going to link it in the show notes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's talk about the movie now. First off, Sam, any other thoughts that you had just off the bat? Like, if you liked it, if you didn't like it?
I loved it.
Yeah,
I gotta say, it's usually difficult for me to watch movies this old, just because I feel like it's very slow moving and not very exciting. And I have a bit of a case of ADHD, which of course means I can't go to the store without spending all my money on candy.
Don't you think that grocery shopping would be so much easier if you had a golem you could send to do it for you?
Well, that's what Instacart shoppers are, basically.
Yeah.
But anyway, this was the one movie from the era where I didn't have to watch it at like 2 times the speed to enjoy it. So that's a raving endorsement from me.
This was actually the third Golem movie that Wegener would direct, although it's tragically the only one that is not lost. The previous 2 were much lower budget, but this third one is actually the only one of them that narrates the famous story of the Golem of Prague, this very popular legend that the story is based on. It was much higher budget than the other 2 movies, and I think that to some extent it was actually the original kind of project that Wegener and Galien had set out to tell, but they weren't able to raise all of this money until 5 years after the first one was released.
Yeah, so basically all of these movies, they're deeply inspired by the stories about the Golem of Prague, which basically goes that a very famous rabbi who lived in Prague in the late 16th century, named Rabbi Judah Ben Zalel, also known as the Maharal in Jewish sources. He supposedly created this golem to protect the Jewish community from anti-Semitic attacks from all kinds of creatures. And this golem, he's very strong, he's very powerful. And if you go to Prague today, you're just going to see this guy everywhere. It's just Golem Central over there. It's one of their big tourist gimmicks, of course, because as we're going to learn later, this story is not as ancient as it would seem.
Right. And, I think it's kind of a common theme for Gladio Free Europe, isn't it? There's something that people assume to be very ancient or medieval, and then we find out that when you look a little bit closer, it might not be as old as you expect.
Yeah, well, it's still fun.
Oh, absolutely,
so,
yeah.
Glad people
The Golem
cook.
story was incredibly well known at this time throughout Germany, the Czech Republic, and really much of Europe at large, including they're also quite well known in the United States, probably thanks in large part to Jewish immigration. So that means that this was a very well-known story. So even when people were seeing the first 2 films that did not explain how the Rabbi Lowe created the Golem, people knew what was going on. One thing that all of these movies feature in common, in addition to the fact that Paul Wegener plays this monstrous creature, is that his wife, who then was his ex-wife and then became his wife again, Lida Salmanova, was cast as a beautiful woman in each of these, although I think she actually plays a different character in every one. And there's usually some kind of love triangle element, potentially involving the Golem himself.
Yep. So let's get into it. As Gladia mentioned, there are 3 Golem movies in this series, but the first 2, they actually take place in a contemporary setting, although they use the Golem as this sort of villainous creature which is attacking modern Germany, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Whereas the third Golem movie, which is the one that we watched for this episode, it goes all the way back to the 16th century to tell the origin story of this creature, which had haunted the German silver screen for so many years by that point.
Right. So the first one from 1915 is basically a mummy's curse kind of story. It's about a secular Jewish antiquities dealer who finds this golem in an old synagogue, as well as this amulet that's used to animate it. He accidentally brings the creature to life and initially just used it to do chores. But the golem quickly falls in love with this guy's daughter, and then it goes on a murderous rampage trying to kill the daughter's gentile boyfriend. And it ends with the antiquities dealer pushing the golem off of a rooftop and allowing his daughter and her boyfriend to live a life in peace.
Yeah, and this movie was actually quite interesting because one of the books that I read for this episode is Maya Barzilai's Golem book, published in 2016, and she talks about how it was so stunning that Paul Wegener, who had volunteered to fight in World War One was simultaneously on the front lines as well as gracing the silver screen for viewers back home.
Right.
This was something that was very new to the people of the time.
Yeah, well, and we'll touch on that later on in the episode. Yeah, and then the second one, after he got back to Germany when the war was still over, is very funny. It's called The Golem and the Dancing Girl. Do you want to talk about this one?
Oh yeah, I love this one because it's just so meta, which again speaks to just how innovative these guys were in the ways that they thought. Because this could easily be something that could be riffed on today.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, so Monova, she comes back to play a different role this time, but she's still the leading female. She plays an actress who goes to see the original Golem movie from 1915 because she was told that the lead female actress looks just like her. And when she's standing in the foyer before the movie starts admiring the Golem statue, the director of the film comes up to her and he's like, hey, you know what? I was just talking to the real Golem, Paul Wegener, and he would love to meet you. But she's not really interested in the real guy. She just really wants this statue. So she asks that it be delivered to her house, which is done promptly. And using this as a pretext, Wegener gets into the Golem costume and he sneaks into her apartment while she's away, hiding the statue and putting himself in her place. And then antics ensue. We don't really know much about the plot because the movie wasn't well attended because, again, this was 1917. This was the worst moment for the German war effort.
Yeah.
But now let's get to the big one, the only one that survives to us in one piece.
This is the one that this episode is about. This is the one that's this genuine art film that is talked about quite often in many different conversations, where they're talking about the history of art cinema, the history of horror cinema, or the history of depictions of Judaism in cinema. This is 1920, The Golem, how he came into the world. And as we mentioned, this is the first one where they actually had the budget to allow for this grand period piece with elaborate sets, which again is what Galeen and Wegener had initially wanted to do.
Yeah, so the opening shot of the movie is just beautiful. They didn't have color film then yet, but they still found a way to overlay color over the film. So we open with this shot of the blue sky as Rabbi Lowe is reading the stars. And while he's doing this, he learns that there's a terrible process in the making, that the cruel emperor is about to expel the Jews. And as it turns out, he's right, because just as this is happening, the next shot in the scene shows a handsome young squire named Florian, who's told to go to the Jewish quarter and deliver a proclamation telling the Jews that they must leave Prague before the new moon. So Florian, he makes his way into the ghetto, which is surrounded by this massive wall, which totally separates the Jews from the Christians. But in the process of delivering this message, he's just totally struck by the rabbi's beautiful daughter Miriam, once again played by Lydia Solomonova.
Yes.
Yeah. So Rabbi Lowe, he's a well-regarded figure, so he's able to convince Florian to get him an audience with the emperor. And in the meantime, him and his assistant, they go about creating this golem creature out of clay.
Yeah, and it's a pretty funny looking creature. It's got massive feet, like bigger than its head by far, and its head itself is adorned with this weird haircut headdress kind of thing that looks basically identical to a flapper haircut, which would about to become very popular in Weimar Germany.
Yeah, some of the reviewers that Barzilai quotes in the book talk about how Wegener is perfect for the role because he just looks kind of Asiatic, I guess, very exotic.
Yes, it was bizarre. There was like race science they're doing about this German guy saying like, oh yeah, he looks so strange. He's perfect for a monster.
So they get to the good stuff. They're finally ready to bring the golem to life. So Lowe and his assistant, they began a magical ceremony to speak to a demon from another plane of existence called...
the demon Astaroth.
Yes, exactly. So with his magic wand, Rabbi Lowe, he makes a giant circle of flames, which comes up right from the floor. There are fireballs flying all around them, and suddenly the huge disembodied head of Astaroth emerges. Lowe demands that the demon tell him the word necessary to bring the golem to life. And as it turns out, this word is emet, which is the word for truth. So Go, he writes this word on a scroll, and he puts it in an amulet, which is attached to the golem's chest. It's in the shape of a star.
Right. And that's all it takes, because then suddenly lightning flashes and the monster opens its eyes. It's alive!
Yeah, and it's really neat because this shot, it really seems like it was done in one take. They found a way to swap the dummy for Wegener himself.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so Lo, he commands the creature to be a servant, and he takes it to the court of the emperor to entertain the Gentiles, I suppose. And so, so he's there to demonstrate his great Jewish magic and learning, and he basically shows them the world's first movie all the way back in the 16th century, telling them that he will show them the history of the Jews, but they must promise not to laugh.
Yeah.
So images begin to appear on the wall showing the injustices suffered by the Jewish people since biblical times. The wandering Jew is shown, at which point people just start laughing hysterically. And clearly God is not happy with this, so in an act of divine punishment, the palace begins to collapse. But the rabbi, he commands the golem to use its mighty strength to hold up the roof to save the lives of all of these nobles, which makes the emperor realize that he must allow the Jews to remain in Prague.
Right. And so this all seems to be good, right? It seems to be well. But there is one problem here, and that problem is the emperor's squire, Florian.
Yeah, it turns out that he really took a liking to the rabbi's daughter, and, he goes over there for regular booty calls. And one day, the rabbi's assistant, who is also in love with Lydia, he discovers that there's a strange man in his room. So he wakes up the golem, which had been deactivated because the rabbi had discovered that after a certain point, the golem would be possessed by an evil spirit. And so the assistant, he tells the golem to get rid of this guy. So he breaks down the door and starts to pursue the man in question. But although the rabbi knows that the golem at this point in time is possessed by an evil demon, and he has the potential to commit great acts of evil, which means that when the golem gets to Florian, he doesn't just drag him out of the ghetto. Instead, he throws him off the roof, killing him in the process. And then he turns against the Jews of the ghetto as well. He tries to kill Lo's assistant and Miriam, and then sets the ghetto on fire. Although, at the last moment, he takes mercy upon Miriam, and he just drags her outside by her hair.
But it's a pretty frightening scene in the fire, because there's a really elaborate scene in the synagogue where some kind of Shabbat is happening, and then somebody rushes in and says, "Oh, the whole town is on fire. We've got to do something." But the problem is, this whole Jewish quarter is surrounded by these thick walls, so all of the people are trapped inside.
Yeah. At which point they're trying to escape the ghetto, but just as it seems that all hope is lost, Rabbi Lo is able to commune with the demon Astaroth one more time and get him to leave the golem's body, who is now free of demonic influence. The golem now uses his strength to break open the walls of the ghetto and set the people free. So he's walking outside the ghetto, and he runs into a group of a bunch of little gentile children, girls mostly, and he has a tender moment with them. He just joins them in their playing. And just as he picks one of them up, she accidentally pulls the amulet off of his chest, thereby putting him into a slumber. He collapses, and he's just laying there, totally inanimate until the amulet is restored to his body.
Yeah.
So after this, the Jewish people, they find the body of the golem surrounded by these children who are just playing around outside of it, and they bring the golem back into the ghetto. They praise God for saving them from the fire, and at this point, a giant Star of David is superimposed over the screen, and that's the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
The way I watched this movie, I saw it as a movie about this seemingly unthinking machine that's supposed to be just like this brute that does the bidding of the people who command him. He comes into a sense of himself. In fact, there is a scene in the movie where the rabbi, he's trying to deactivate the golem, but he just keeps swatting his hand away from the amulet because the golem doesn't want to go back into his inanimate state.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, I think you're right about that. The golem itself was very popular in Germany and the United States because this was a really big hit on both sides of the Atlantic. I think that what got most of the attention in this movie were the really elaborate sets and costumes, which were just very impressive for the time. This was kind of like a semi-epic with the production values. There had been some movies like this before, but not that many. And Germany, as we've mentioned in earlier episodes, usually had a pretty meager film industry. They had a lot of talent, but not a lot of money. So it was a really big deal that this one was just such a pageant.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the other things that Barzilai mentions in her book is that Paul Wegener was deeply shaped by his war experiences. At one point, he was one of only 4 people in his group that survived a battle. So he obviously came back from the front really deeply affected by all of this. And for this reason, one could argue that the Jewish quarter of Prague, as depicted in this movie, is basically set up in the style of these World War I's trenches.
Right. It's very shady with these huge, very tall buildings on all sides, just like a trench. Yeah.
Yeah. There's this constant fear of just the structure collapsing around you, which again happens quite often on the Western
time.
Front.
Yeah. Just digging a trench could be deadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And
then I think all of the fire elements definitely bring to mind, just like the immolation of the war.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. One other kind of interesting war connection, which is very ironic given what would happen later, is that, so this movie was made by UFA, which was the state-run German film studio initially created to produce German propaganda. And for that reason, the head of UFA at this time, I believe, was Erich Ludendorff. And so he's this, this is a far-right nationalist German, essentially, film producer. And he's making this movie that ends with essentially a celebration of Jewish life, you could say. But then just a couple years later, after he left government, Ludendorff would be involved in the 1923 beer hall putsch alongside the Nazis.
Aye.
It's just a weird little connection there. But let's keep talking about the people involved here. So you mentioned how Wegener, he plays the Golem. He directed this movie. He was a World War I veteran. I know that he actually his combat was so deadly that he ended up getting the famous Iron Cross when he got back.
Yeah.
Another important person, though, is the writer Henrik Galeen, because he had a different kind of background. I feel like he was an actor also, but I don't believe he served in the war directly, but he obviously was also very affected by this. And he would, as we mentioned, he would go on to later write the screenplay for Nosferatu after this, probably propelled in large part by the success of this movie.
Yeah, he was a very interesting guy. He was a secular Jew who nevertheless felt some connection to that identity, but also mystic stuff writ large. So for this reason, we just see all of these occultic elements and symbols scattered both throughout this movie as well as his later works like Nosferatu.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he was friends with Albin Grau, who was this very odd occultist in Germany, who would eventually later be I believe his organization would later be banned by the Nazis because it was too weird for them, essentially. But yeah, it really kind of touches on this broad interest in all types of mysticism, including the Jewish Kabbalah. What are your thoughts on the visuals, and besides the golem effect and the way that the streets kind of look like trenches?
It's just very striking. It's very shadowy. It's just it's a very claustrophobic environment, just comparing the way that the ghetto itself looks with the wide open spaces of the Emperor's Palace of gentile society writ large. There's a sense that the separation of Jews is something that's very deeply traumatic.
Right. And you notice even you mentioned how the gentile court is wide open. In addition, all of the Jewish houses are kind of crooked. As if they're made by, it's meant probably to imply they're made with cheap materials, but it looks very weird and quite literally askew. And it even kind of reminds you of Dr. Seuss, the way that the roofs look and all that.
Oh yeah, it's all very pointy.
Yeah. I also liked the staircase, which for whatever reason looks just like a conch shell.
Mm-hmm. And for all these designs, we have to thank a certain guy named Hans Polzig.
Yes.
Who came from an aristocratic background. And in fact, Liam, you dug this up. His mother was related to Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. But because his mother was, she liked to sleep around, Hans's father abandoned them and sent him away to be raised by a middle-class music teacher.
Right, yeah. No, so it's not hard to see why he might have had some reservations about the German nobility. If, that's his own background and they totally cast him out because of something that was completely outside of his own control.
Yeah, absolutely. And this movie, it had an enormous budget for its time. Like, it was basically an epic with all of these massive sets and multiple crowd scenes.
I believe that they built 56 buildings for the set, which is insane. Wow. I don't think even today that's very common.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, and then all the crowds. There's so many crowd scenes. Like there's the scene where all the Jews are celebrating, and then the scene right after where the town catches on fire and they have to escape. There's all of the choreography, like the dance scene at the Emperor's Palace, and then all the people in the synagogue praying and, together.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and that prayer, just totally inaccurate. That's not what a Jewish service looks like at all. So as we mentioned, Henry Galeen, exactly a Jewish family, had no idea what Judaism is, basically.
Yeah. And I'm sure, Wegener even less.
Yeah, but nevertheless, they felt a connection to this Jewish figure. So we have to ask ourselves, where does the golem come from? And why is it so captivating for the minds of these early 20th century Germans?
Right. Well, so probably the main financial reason why it made sense to make a movie about the golem at this time was because a recently published novel just called The Golem by the writer Gustav Meyrink was a really big success. Maya Barzilai calls it the Da Vinci Code of its time. But we should mention, though, that the depiction of the golem in this book really has nothing to do with the golem of Wegener's work. Because it's kind of strange. From what I understand, I haven't read it, but it basically uses the golem as kind of a metaphorical figure and is mostly in the mind of some shopkeeper, right?
Yeah, it's weird. I don't understand it myself. I just read a bunch of synopses and tried to reconstruct it. But it's basically like a psychological horror novel. I got the sense that it's kind of like Stephen King's work. In fact, I've seen many people draw that comparison directly. Uh-huh. But anyway, can't talk about Meyrink too much here just because...
It was just that it was a huge hit, which is probably why they were able to say, give us a ton of money to make this third Golem movie, because everyone's reading Meyrink's Golem.
But even though Meyrink's Golem had nothing to do with the Golem mythology, the Golem was on everyone's mind back in those days. There were a lot of these stories circulating in many different variants, but there are generally a few constant elements in play here. There's a Jewish community in Prague which is being threatened by a cruel Holy Roman Emperor with either expulsion or genocide, and the Jews of Prague turn to the mystical Rabbi Loew for protection. And so, in turn, he builds them a creature out of clay, bringing it to life by placing a scroll with the magical inscriptions inside of the monster. He calls this creature Golem, which is a Hebrew word that appears just once in the Bible, but believe me, we're going to get into it. And it's basically like an unshaped mass. It's like something that's not completed, but which through God's power will come to life, basically. Mm-hmm. In these stories, generally, after the Golem successfully protects the city's Jews from anti-Semites, it either goes on a violent rampage and starts killing Christian civilians writ large, or it turns on the Jews themselves by desecrating Shabbat services. Ultimately, Loew is able to bring the golem to heal by taking the scroll out of its body or something similar, and he puts its dormant body in an attic in the Altneuschul Synagogue, still standing in Prague, where it's believed to lie to this day.
Mm-hmm. And we should mention that some people actually do believe that.
Yeah. If you tell someone from Prague that the golem doesn't exist, they might actually get offended. Here we should mention now that although the story is often believed to date back to the 16th century itself, or even earlier, it seems like no one was telling this particular story until the early 19th century. There's from 1834, there's a version by Seligman Kohn. In 1836, there's a guy named Ludwig August Frankl, and I believe he's the first one to mention that the golem is in the attic of the synagogue. And then probably the best attested early version in 1837 is by Berthold Auerbach. He claimed that this story would have been told to Baruch Spinoza, the famous philosopher, by his nursemaids in the 17th century, but that seems pretty unlikely, especially because Auerbach himself might have embellished on the story somewhat.
He was a folklorist, part of the same folk tradition as the famous Brothers Grimm, and he went around Germany collecting folktales from both Jews and Christians and writing them in these various compilations. But like most folklorists, Auerbach would usually add some kind of his own touch to these stories to make them more exciting and engaging. But in any case, thanks to the work of him and other folklorists around this time, this story quickly began spreading outside of Germany, particularly into Jewish communities abroad, such as the deeply religious communities of Eastern European Jews.
Yeah, and then come the early 20th century, there are new versions of the Golem story, which gain increasing popularity among both Jewish and Gentile audiences alike, all across Europe as well as the United States, which by now has a significant Jewish population thanks to immigration. And so the book, The Golem by Gustav Meyrink, who himself wasn't Jewish, but he in fact was often accused of being Jewish because he was anti-war, basically.
Oh, God.
But yeah, so Meyrink's novel, it was very widely circulated. It sold something like 200,000 copies by 1920, which even today would be impressive. But anyway, Paul Wegener, he insisted that he was not inspired by this novel, but it's very likely that either him or the screenwriter Heinrich Galeen would have read Meyrink's version at some point, possibly while in the trenches themselves, because this book was so popular that it was in fact issued in a mini pocket edition, which soldiers would be able to carry with them to the front.
This also kind of brings to mind, for potential legal reasons, you might not want to associate it too much with that book, especially if it's very recently published. Because as we talked about in the Nosferatu episode, Nosferatu was essentially a ripoff of Dracula. But to avoid those allegations, they claimed actually that they had been told this story by some random Austrian peasant or something during World War I. And then, oh no, it really happened. This guy told us that he met a vampire.
Yeah, but one thing I will say in favor of Meyrink's version having an influence on Galeen and Wegener is that it was published with these beautiful, very stark illustrations that are very angular, that are very dark, kind of twisted. It's really hard to make heads or tails, and it does seem probable that at very least in terms of set design, Meyrink played a role in the look of this movie.
Yeah, definitely possible. So Sam, you did a lot of really cool research in the origin of Golem stories. One thing that you found out is that there's a pretty strong case to be made that although this specific story of Rabbi Lowe is modern, the idea of a golem goes back very, very far, not just into the ancient history of Judaism, but could even predate Judaism altogether.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's an ancient tradition. As I mentioned, there's one mention of a golem in the Bible. But really, Jews were one of many peoples in the Near East who believed in the power of either the divine or human agents to create life. So in the Genesis story, we have God making life out of clay in the Garden of Eden. This becomes Adam, and then later his rib is taken from him, and that's turned into Eve. But really, this tradition, it goes back quite a long way. In fact, even before Semitic languages were dominant in the region, there's one Sumerian goddess called Namu, who was basically the primordial sea, and she was one of the gods of the pantheon, who would later be adapted by the Akkadians.
Right, and yeah, Akkadians are Semitic speakers who are commonly called Babylonians in popular discourse.
Yeah, so the Akkadians, they preserved a myth called Enki and Nimna, which was written no later than the 18th century before the Common Era, which gives a version of humanity's origins. There are quite a few of these stories, but I found this one interesting just because it's not one you usually come across. So for this telling, I used the book Babylonian Creation Myths by Lambert, where he translated a lot of these creation stories by himself. But before we begin the myth itself, let's just note how it starts. Quote, "On that day, the day when heaven was separated from the earth," and again, that's just verbatim Genesis.
Yeah, super similar.
Which goes to show that this was an area that had a very ancient interconnected mythology across all of these different cultures, and the Bible arose in this milieu. So, Liam, why don't you take us off?
In those times, the gods had already been birthed by Namu, and they got fruitful and multiplied. But their existence was burdensome. They had to make their own sustenance, and the lesser gods were forced to work for the greater gods, digging rivers and whatnot. They were unhappy about this, and Namu, in the primordial sea, heard their anguish. Namu tells her son Enki about this and asks her to remedy the situation. "My son, arise from your bed. With your expertise, you must seek out skill. Create a substitute for the gods, so that they will be relieved of their toil."
And Enki agrees to his mother's request, saying, "My mother, there is my blood which you set aside. Impose it to the corvée of the gods. When you have mixed it in the clay from above the Apsu, the birth goddesses will nip off clay, and you must fashion bodies."
So then Enki assembles a whole retinue of goddesses to help Namu create humans. Among them, Ninma. After humans were born, the gods celebrated by holding a feast. Unfortunately, they got too drunk and got into an argument about who's more powerful. So Nimna creates disabled humans. Freaks is the word used in the text, and it's up to Enki to fix their defects. The blind man is endowed with the art of singing. The barren woman is given the art of weaving. A person without any genitalia at all is made to become the king's courtier. Enki then tells Nimna to fix one creation, a misshapen, prematurely born baby called Umul, which means at death's door. And then when Ninma saw Umul, she turned upwards. She approached Umul, questioning it, but she didn't open its mouth. She gave it bread to eat, but it did not stretch out its hand. She offered it her hand, but it could not rise. She laid down a mattress for it, but it could not lie on it. It could not stand, it could not sit, it could not lie, it could do nothing at all. Nimna was unable to do anything to give Umul life, which ultimately meant she was not as strong of a god as Enki.
Yeah, and again, this idea that humans are made out of clay by the gods is a recurring one. The most famous story that we have from these people is, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods, they see that Gilgamesh is a bad king. He's very cruel to his people. So they create this guy called Enkidu to humble him for oppressing and for all of his misdeeds. Enkidu would go on to become Gilgamesh's friend. But in any case, how does Enkidu get made?
The goddess Aruru, she washed her hands, took a pinch of clay, and threw it down in the wild. In the wild, she created Enkidu, the hero, offspring of silence, knit strong but inerta. So there you have it. He is made from clay.
Yeah, and note the silent part. Enkidu at first is basically a wild animal. He's totally naked. He hunts. He doesn't speak. He's unable to speak, but ultimately, he's terrorizing the people so much that a woman just decides she's just gonna have sex with him for weeks until he's civilized and brought to the level of man. In any case, the Babylonians weren't the only people to have such ideas. In fact, there's an even closer analog to the golem found in Egyptian mythology, where often, if you'll go to a museum, you'll find all these little figurines taken from tombs displayed. These guys are called sheptis, literally the answerers, and they're basically buried with people to serve as servants in the afterlife. They often bore inscriptions on their bodies, which signified either their role or various spells. But let's get to the Jewish stuff. After all, that's the most well-known of these in our culture. And so the story of Genesis is the most well-known of the stories that play with these kinds of themes. So as we know, after God creates Earth, he begins to make life to live upon it. And Adam would become the first man. There are actually two stories of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. And this is the result of the book being a composite of several different texts. But the better known one and the more detailed one is Genesis 2. Genesis 2 is the one where Eve is made of Adam's rib, whereas in Genesis 1, man and woman, who go unnamed in this version, are created along with all other life without further elaboration. But yeah, Genesis 2 is the more detailed of the two, so let's get into it. Here's how the JPS Bible renders Genesis 2, verse 7. The Lord God created man, and note the word for man is Adam in Hebrew, from the dust of the earth, which in Hebrew is Adamah. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Here I just wanted to make an interesting linguistic note. In Genesis 1, the word used for creation is bara, which is used to denote the act of creation ex nihilo. Whereas in Genesis 2, when it comes to human, the word used is yatzal, which is basically formed or fashioned. This is the same word that would be used for pottery. among other things. So, thus, we can see that God has the power to create life and the means by which he does it. The physical human form is crafted and God breathes the spirit of life into him. In the Jewish tradition, humans can also attain the power to create life, but through incantation or the use of particular words, rather than through the divine breath. But before we continue, we really have to ask ourselves, what is a golem?
Right, because the word golem never appears in Genesis, even though it kind of refers to the Genesis narrative. Instead, it appears in Psalm 139, denoting the unshaped matter through which God's power can be formed into a human.
Yeah, so Psalm 139, it was a praise song which was purportedly written by King David, and in it he celebrates God for his omniscience and omnipresence, which even extends into the womb. Verse 16 of this psalm reads, quote, "Your eyes saw my unshaped form," that's galmi in the Hebrew. "They were all recorded in your book. In due time they were formed, to the very last one of them." So here we see that the golem is basically a mass of inanimate matter which, through God's power, can take on living form. In the Talmud, which is the most important text in Judaism after the Bible itself, we learn more about all of this lore, and in fact, we even learn that Adam was a golem himself before he received a soul. Let's look at a passage from Sanhedrin 38b.
Rabbi Yohanan bar Hanina says, "Daytime is 12 hours long, and the day Adam, the first man, was created was divided as follows. In the first hour, his dust was gathered. In the second, a golem was fashioned. In the third, his limbs were extended. In the fourth, a soul was cast into him. In the fifth, he stood on his legs. In the sixth, he called the creatures by the names he gave them. In the seventh, Eve was paired with him. And in the eighth, they arose to the bed 2 and descended 4. That means Cain and Abel were immediately born. In the ninth, he was commanded not to eat the tree of knowledge. In the 10th, he sinned. In the 11th, he was judged. And in the 12th, he was expelled and left the Garden of Eden."
Wow, rough first day. Yeah, and then later on, a passage from the same daf, which is a page from Sanhedrin 38b, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, quote, "Adam, the first man, spanned from one end of the earth until the other, as it is stated in Deuteronomy 4:32, since the day that God created man upon the earth, and from the one end of heaven unto the other. This means that on the day that Adam was created, he spanned from one end of the heavens until the other. Once Adam sinned, the Holy One, blessed be he, placed his hand on him and diminished him." And this story is interesting because it's partly an allegory for Adam's spiritual diminution following his sin, but it's interesting compared to later golem stories where the reverse takes place, as in, man as made by God is enormous, and he is made to shrink, while the man-made golem, in many of these stories, starts small, but he grows at an alarming pace, which forces its creator to shut it down. And side note, although God made Adam smaller after this, he was still huge. According to Bava Batra 75a, he was shrunk down to the measly height of 100 cubits. That's 150 feet for anyone who prefers modern use.
And is that where we get the whole weird conspiracy theory about giant ancient humans? The
Yes,
Nephilim?
Exactly. That's it. Yes,
that's hilarious. God, I feel like so much of this, you kind of like, would you call this Kabbalistic, this kind of stuff?
Oh, no. This predates the Kabbalah. This is just Talmud.
Okay, I guess like a lot of the Talmud stuff is just very, very weird, and that when you're coming from any kind of like Christian perspective, it's just so different, such a different interpretation of these same stories than you're used to.
Yeah, this is all interesting stuff. Like basically, Kabbalah, it stems from many of these interpretations, and in some ways it shaped these stories as well in a way, because the traditions which would become Kabbalah, they're very ancient, and the people who and the people who were recording these stories, they would have been familiar with some of this. So later on, when we get to the medieval period, some medieval Jews came to believe that a rabbi who was sufficiently righteous could have the power to create life. He's essentially able to play God. This interpretation of scripture is probably the initial folkloric origin of the Golem story. which we find
that's pretty kind of a pretty crazy. No, I shouldn't say crazy, but it's a pretty interesting belief too. Seems very radical. The idea that a holy enough person can have this godly role and create a life.
Yeah, well, it makes sense once we get into the context, but also a lot of this stuff was allegorical, not necessarily meant to be taken literally as practiced by the medieval Jewish mystics. But let's look at the passage which really gave way to many of these interpretations. In Sanhedrin 65b, we see this passage in the midst of a debate on the nature of sorcery. What's prohibited and what isn't.
Rava says, if the righteous wish to do so, they can create a world as it is stated, but your iniquities have separated between you and your God. In other words, there is no distinction between God and a righteous person who has no sins. And just as God created the world, so can the righteous. Indeed, Rava created a man, a golem, using forces of sanctity. Rava sent his creation before Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera would speak to him, but he would not reply. Rabbi said to him, you were created by one of the members of the group, one of the sages. Return to your dust. The Gemara relates another fact, substantiating the statement that the righteous could create a world if they so desired. Rav Hanina and Rab Oshaya would sit every Shabbat Eve and engage in the study of the Sefer Yetzirah, and a third-born calf would be created for them, and they would eat it in honor of the Shabbat.
Yeah, and note the implication here. There's nothing necessarily wrong with creating life, unlike the other kinds of sorcery that's described in the debate, which is a big contrast to later modern Christian stories like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This also sets the earliest golem literature apart from later interpretations like the film by Wegener.
Right, where there's kind of moralistic, this moralism is cast on the creator of the golem.
Yeah, but nevertheless, as we can see, humans seem to lack a special oomph that really creates fully fledged human life. Although a righteous person can create life, it's not perfect the way that God's creation can be, because he can't speak. And this kind of thought would also be present in other heterodox sects which appeared at the time, such as the Gnostics, which is really a big umbrella term, but we don't have time to get into it. But some of these Gnostics, they essentially believed that the physical world was evil because it was created not by God, but by a demiurge, who was sort of this deformed emanation of God. And some of the later medieval commentaries on the golem would argue that the golem can't speak because the golem lacks a neshima, which is sort of the higher and intellectual soul. All living beings are taken to have a nefesh and a ruach, like the nefesh being basically like an mammalian soul. That's what regulates like your desires, instincts, basic living processes like breathing, etc. But the neshima, it's what gives people the power to think and also to speak. Mm-hmm. So the human status of the golem thus becomes a site of debate in medieval times. But also, just to continue the comparative tradition, compare the tripartite soul system with the Platonic schema, where it's also taken that humans have 3 basic souls within them, which just goes to show all of this is contextual and all of it is derived from intercultural conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we see from the story that the man who's created by Rava, he has the appearance of a normal person, but he can't speak, which is what separates man from animals. So presumably, even the most righteous man cannot reach God's heights by imbuing his creation with disability. Although this was not necessarily universally true, some of the later commentators would argue that it's not impossible per se for a person to create something that's fully human with these techniques, but rather that Rava himself was just not pure enough to accomplish this. One of the main sources for this episode is Golem by Moshe Idel, which places this entire exchange in Sanhedrin in a polemical context between Jewish and pagan magicians, and righteousness is taken to mean greater spiritual and magical power. So think about this in the context of the famous contest between Moses, Aaron, and the Pharaoh's magicians in Exodus 7. Aaron turns his staff into a snake, and the Egyptians are able to do the same, but then Aaron's snake eats the others. So magic is something that the pagans can use, presumably by appealing to lesser powers such as demons, but magic derived from God trumps everything else. But before we continue, let's look at some alternative uses for the word golem in Jewish texts. these would have influence on conceptions of the artificial golem going forward. One of these is used to denote an unfinished good, such as a vessel or a forged knife which does not yet have an edge. That's a golem in the Talmud. And transitively, golem was also taken to apply to a certain type of guy with intellectual pretensions that you've probably encountered in college. Let's look at this passage from Pirkei Avot 5:7.
There are 7 things characteristic of a golem, and 7 in a wise man. A wise man does not speak before one who is greater than he in wisdom, and does not break into his fellow's speech, and is not hasty to answer. He asks what is relevant, he answers to the point, and he speaks of the first point first, and of the last point last. And concerning that which he has not heard, he says, I have not heard, and he acknowledges the truth. And the reverse of these are characteristic of a golem.
Yeah, so this vessel metaphor would also come into use in the Kabbalah. Basically, the human as an unfinished vessel. In the Kabbalistic reading, the body is a vessel for divine emanations. But there's also another kind of golem that we find in Sanhedrin 22b, the unmarried woman.
Rav Shmuel Bar Unya says in the name of Rav, a woman is golem, like a vessel that has not been completed, and makes a covenant before being truly connected, only to the one who has made her a vessel through her first act of sexual intercourse, as it is stated. For your master is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name. Ugh, that's creepy stuff there.
Yeah, well, that's just ancient times for you.
Well, throughout this episode, Sam, a couple times you mentioned something called the Sefer Yetzirah. What exactly is this text? Could you expand more on that?
Yeah, so the Sefer Yetzirah, it's hard to say, really. It translates to the Book of Formation. And as we saw previously in our discussion of Genesis 2, Yetzirah is derived from the same root as gets used to describe God's creation of Adam. It's really one of the most important texts in early Jewish mysticism, and it would become a cornerstone of the Kabbalah in the Middle Ages. It's very short. The long recension contains 6 chapters of around 2,600 words, but it's really impenetrable, which makes a lot of sense when you consider that this is knowledge that shouldn't be accessible to ordinary people. Just to give you guys a taste of what this book is like, here's how the Vatican version starts.
Yah, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the living God, God Almighty, high and exalted, dwelling forever and holy in his name, carved out 32 wondrous paths of wisdom. He created the universe with 3 groups of letters, Sephirim, with Seper and Seper and Seper. The 10 Sephirot are the basis and the 22 letters are the foundation. The 10 Sephirot are the basis. The number of the 10 figures, 5 opposite 5, and the covenant of unity is exactly in the middle by word of the tongue and mouth and the circumcision of the flesh. The 10 Sephirot are the basis, 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. Understand with wisdom and be wise with understanding. Test them and investigate them. Know and ponder a form. Get the thing clearly worked and restore the creator to his place. And their measure is 10, for they have no limit.
Yeah, so the Sefer Yetzirah tells us to understand, but I didn't understand what's going on. So what's the deal there?
Good question. Yeah, I guess you're not holy enough. I'm sorry, Sam.
Yeah, tragic. But although I can't tell you what the Sefer Yetzirah actually means, I could tell you somewhat what the Sefer Yetzirah is. As we saw, it's a highly symbolic linguistic text which ties the letters of the Hebrew alphabet with the cosmogony of the world. Like, basically, these letters are basically the code that makes up the algorithm of our universe. The principles of the Hebrew language can be used to unlock the secrets of the universe and presumably to access godly powers. Per the Sefer Yetzirah itself and greater Kabbalistic Jewish traditions, the book was first delivered by God to Abraham. Some believe that Abraham was able to create life based on the passage Genesis 12:5. Yeah, here's a translation that I did verbatim because I felt like the nuances weren't coming across in the ones that were available. So it reads, And Abraham took Sarah his wife, and Lot, son of his brother, and all of their wealth which they had earned, and all of the souls which they asu at Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Asu, it's a very common word in Hebrew. It literally means they made or produced in the most common usage, but it could also be used in the sense of acquired. So taken literally, these souls in question might be their slaves or servants, but the preferred normative reading is that is that Abraham and Sarah, they proselytized that Halan, making souls in the sense of people who were aware of God and his laws. And in this sense, the Talmud preserves this sense of making souls. There's a passage in there somewhere that talks about how if you teach Jewish texts to your friend's son, you have made a soul. But as for the origin of the Sefer Yetzirah, it's very difficult to say. Although we did see in the above passage, Sanhedrin 65b, that there is a reference to a Sefer Yetzirah, it's almost 1,000 years before we get any more references to it, which leads some to believe that this was a later interpolation into the Talmud. While others posit that it really is an ancient text, which was transmitted orally, beginning from the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 2nd century after the Common Era. It's hard to say, but it seems very heavily rooted in Hellenistic philosophy, which would put a hard limit on its antiquity. So there are 3 main recensions of this text and many more variants. It's a very unstable text just because it's very difficult to understand and presumably very difficult to copy. The oldest alleged commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah was attributed to Saadia Gaon, who lived in the first half of the 10th century in Egypt, and he was a very famous rabbi and theologian unto himself. But Moshe Idel believes that this is a false attribution, that it was in fact written in France around the 13th century. The oldest confirmed surviving commentary is from right around that period. It was written by the Italian Sabbatai Donolo in the mid-10th century, and the oldest surviving fragment, which was found in the Cairo Geniza, dates to around the same time. As for the contents of the book, it's centered around these Sefirot Belima, which is a very unclear phrase, some associated with the Sefirot of the later Kabbalistic tradition, although others say that it's not exactly the same thing. But in any case, these Sefirot Belima, they're elaborated on in the first chapter, and the remaining 5 chapters deal with phonetic analysis as ontology of these biconsonantal combinations, based on all the possible combinations of Hebrew letters. As there are 22 Hebrew letters, there are 231 possible 2-letter combinations. But for some reason, some versions of the text write 221 combinations. So knowledge of these combinations and how to recite them in the correct order, it gives you power. Generally, it's understood as a wheel. So moving the wheel forward is an act of creation, but moving it backwards is an act of destruction. So moving the wheel backwards in this case means to reverse the order of the letters and to proceed backwards. So for example, if the initial order is AA, AB, AC, etc., you would start with ZZ, ZY, ZX, and so on and so forth. So these combinations, taken together with some of God's names and sufficient ritual purity, would presumably allow a person to shape reality to his wills. Yeah, so the Sefer Yetzirah, it was very well circulated in medieval times, all the way across the Mediterranean, and there were very different receptions to it in the Sephardic and Ashkenazic context. A reading of the Sefer Yetzirah as literally conferring power to create a physical animated golem was first elaborated by a rabbi named Eliezer of Worms, who lived from 1176 to 1238, of the Hasidei Ashkenaz movement in the Rhineland. And the Jews of the Rhineland in this period were particularly badly hurt because this was the time of the Second Crusade. And these crusaders, when they passed through areas that were populated by Jews, they would often go on a rampage. So in 1196, Eliezer saw his wife and children murdered in front of him by some of these crusaders.
Oh, man.
Yeah, some people have speculated that this was the impetus for considering the creation of the golem in the literal physical sense.
Yeah, you could see why.
As a protector. Yeah, although I think this might be read backwards from later narratives about the golem as a physical protector of the Jews, but who knows, really. Although, in the case of Eliezer of Worms and like some of the later rabbis, this is all purely theoretical. Eliezer did not claim to have done it. Here's an excerpt from his commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah. whoever studies Sefer Yetzirah has to purify himself and don white clothes. It is forbidden to study it alone, but only in groups of 2 or 3. It is incumbent upon him to take virgin soil from a place in the mountains where no one has plowed, and he will knead the dust with living water, that is, water from a flowing source like a river.
Mm-hmm.
And he shall make a body, a golem, and shall begin to permutate the letters of the 221 gates, each limb separately, each limb with the corresponding letter mentioned in the Sefer Yetzirah. And the alphabets will be permuted at the beginning, and afterwards he shall permute with vowels. He shall do this when he is pure. This is from a translation by Moshe Idel, again.
Mm-hmm.
Later commentaries would add elements to this, such as the circumambulation around the golem, and the connection to particular astrological moments, which is how it's depicted in the movie.
Yeah, that's the very beginning, the movement of the stars. Then later on, there's another movement, makes things even worse.
Yeah, exactly. But the Sephardic commentaries on the golem of this period, for the most part, sideline the creation of a physical golem entirely. They just don't really comment on how one could create such a being. Although there is one exception, Avram Abulafia, a Spanish rabbi who still has the reputation as being one of the greatest Kabbalists of all time. He's today considered one of the founders of the ecstatic school of Kabbalah, or called the prophetic school, because it's all about gaining divine insight to give you literal prophetic powers. Yeah,
oh, wow.
So as mentioned previously, there's a very strong emphasis on the direct experience of the divine and the means by which one can accomplish that. So,
yeah.
And this is how the golem story in his context should be read.
Yeah.
Although he makes no direct reference to the golem in the works bearing his name, Moshe Idel believes that an anonymous commentary included in several manuscripts of his works, which were compiled while Abulafia was still alive, was his own writing. His Spanish milieu was not friendly towards such work, which might explain the anonymity. So this commentary, it gives directions that are kind of similar to the methods described by Eliezer of Worms, but there are some key differences. In Abulafia's version, this was to be done in total solitude, and the physical body of the golem isn't constructed. Instead, you only need a spoonful of dirt poured into a glass of pure water, and after that the letter combinations with the names of God are done, but a warning is given.
It is forbidden to do the deed of the Creator, and you shall not learn it in order to perform it, but you shall learn it in order to understand and to teach and to cleave to the great name of God. Praised be He.
In other words, the point here is to prove that this could be done for the purpose of glorifying God and for gaining insight into godly wisdom, not really to create a physical being. In fact, Abulafia warns that all of this stuff is very dangerous, and a misstep in these processes can inflict both physical and spiritual harm to the practitioner, even going so far as to kill him.
And that's some real kind of horror imagery right there, right? Like, oh, you can unlock this ancient magic, but it might also destroy you in the process.
Yeah, exactly, which is why it's such a great source material for later folkloristic elaborations.
Absolutely, yeah.
In a book that actually bears his own name, called Chaye Ha'olam Haba, Abulafia wrote, quote, "Every wise person ought to make souls much more than he ought to make bodies, since the duty of making bodies is solely intended to make souls." And that's the interesting thing about Sephardic golem traditions, whereas the Ashkenazic traditions often focused on the physical elements of the golem. In the Sephardic golem stories, it's mostly a spirit being. It's kind of like a tulpa, basically.
Yeah. That's a comparison.
All right, well, as much as I would love to continue talking about like these theological, Kabbalistic details of the golem and whatnot, unfortunately...
12 fingers, the 20 fingers.
For the sake of brevity, I'm going to have to skip over a bunch of stuff in the development of this golem lore and get into actual stories of people creating the golem.
Right. This is, yeah. If you don't mind me saying so, this I think is the fun stuff. We're talking about how not the conception of the golem in Judaism developed, but the broader golem story that leads to this movie. And what I think is really interesting that I realized kind of across this, that you also kind of touched on, is that although elements of the golem legend do have their roots in genuine Jewish mysticism, a lot of it comes from this later Christian interpretation or misinterpretation of Judaism. like the famous period of Christian Kabbalism, when all of these Renaissance Christians were suddenly incredibly interested in the most esoteric elements of Jewish thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that. In general, like the Renaissance came with the flourishing of alchemical studies writ large, just because that's what people were into back in those days. This was the closest thing they had to science organized around an actual scientific method.
Yeah.
So it was all the rage.
Yeah. And dude, if I had some lead and I could turn that into gold, fuck yeah, I'd be trying to do that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so in this context of the flourishing of alchemy, there was a lot more interest in the idea of artificial men, and and alchemical traditions already had these kinds of traditions, but it really took off starting from the 16th century, really, when a guy named Paracelsus, a really important figure from the early German Renaissance, he greatly popularized the notion of what he called a homunculus, which is an artificial man. And although the techniques that were described by Christian alchemists were quite different from traditional Jewish notions, it would make sense that in this historical context, there would be a further development of the golem stories, just because, like, we often hear about the ghetto and whatnot, and many cities in Europe indeed did ghettoize their Jews, but at the same time, there was a lot of contact, especially in this period, between Jewish and Christian scholars. Yeah, so starting from the 17th century, you start to get stories of concrete golems, like this specific guy actually made a golem and it did this and that. And one of the earliest examples I've come across...
I have to jump for a second. In a sense, isn't every golem concrete?
It's mud, so close enough.
It's close enough.
Yeah, so the earliest golem story that I could find that's attributed to an actual figure doing this in early modern times would be a 17th century source, which attributes to Salomon ben Gabirol, who's this really famous Andalusian philosopher and poet from around the 11th century, I believe. And as the story goes, he created a female golem specifically to do his chores. Liam, why don't you read this quote from Joseph Solomon del Medigo, written around 1625?
It is also related of Solomon ibn Gabriel that he created a woman who waited on him. When he was denounced to the government, he proved that she was not a whole, real creature, but consisted only of pieces of wood and hinges, and reduced her to her original components. And there are many such legends that are told by all, especially in Germany. But the first explicit reference to somebody creating a golem in the sense that we would recognize it today, not out of like these scraps of wood, but out of mud, is related to a Polish manuscript that was written towards the middle of the 17th century, which attributes the act to a certain Rabbi Eliyahu of Chelm. Now Rabbi Eliyahu, he lived a pretty short life. He only lived from 1550 to 1583, but he was really a prodigal figure in his time. He was the first person to get the title of Baal Shem, the master of the name, which speaks to his great expertise in practical Kabbalah. And I have heard, in a certain and explicit way, from several respectable persons that one man living close to our time in the holy community of Chelm, whose name is Rav Eliyahu, the master of the name, who made a golem out of matter and form, and it performed hard work for him for a long time, and the name of Emmet was hanging upon its neck until he finally removed it for a certain reason, the name from his neck, and it turned to dust. That's, again, the translation of Moshe Edel in his Golem book. And in later retellings, the Golem would generally have Emmet written on his forehead, and you can deactivate it by erasing the first letter, spelling Met, dead. And yeah, this story, it spreads really quickly into the Christian milieu for the reasons that we described above, and it would evolve with time. But to give a sense of just how quickly this story circulated, it was already found in Christian sources by 1674. Like in the version by Christoph Arnold, the Baal Shem deactivates the golem because it won't stop growing, but this means that he's subsequently crushed under its weight when he, smudges the name. It becomes a moralistic parable. If you create life, that life you create might somehow eventually turn against you.
Yes, exactly. And we know that this is something that would have been read by Jacob Grimm, who is of the famous Grimm brothers, who were the greatest folklorists of their time. really.
Yeah.
So there we have it.
Their version it's quite similar to the Arnold version. And so this was supposedly collected, from German peasants somewhere. I presume this version would have been collected by Christian peasants. So this is basically the Christian interpretation of the Golem story, which was probably mediated to some extent by Arnold. I would expect that this version was the one that these German peasants had read. So about over 100 years after that story has circulated, the Grimm brothers explained this version. It doesn't really involve the Rabbi of Prague at all. It's actually not set in Germany or the Holy Roman Empire at all. Instead, it's set in Poland. And in this version of the story, a group of Polish Jews created a man out of clay to help them with housework, like we've seen in many of these stories before. Instead of placing a scroll, they carved the word Emmet onto his face, like we've also seen. And interestingly, it's that this story is not attributed to any specific rabbi, but the Polish Jews writ large, which I feel like is interesting because it almost gives it kind of an anti-Semitic implication then. That if the Jews do something wrong in the story, it might be a moralistic message about all Jewish people.
Yeah, that's the sense I get as well. But on the other hand, it also degeneralizes the myth in a way that it can be relatable to more people. So rather than this...
That's true, yeah. It's more general that way, you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and it allows it to spread into other contexts, both time and place.
And so just like in the Arnold version, in this version, the Golem keeps getting bigger and bigger. It can't speak, but it can understand commands. But because it's getting bigger and bigger, people start getting worried, even though it's doing commands for them. It never exactly betrays its master, like you see in some stories, but it becomes so big that it's too dangerous, it's too hard to control. So to stop it from getting so big, people smudge its word, Emmet, to now say Mayat, which means he is dead in Hebrew. And this means the Golem goes dormant and falls asleep. But then one day, he's so big that the only way that the people can actually smudge his face is if he bends over them. So they ask the Golem to bend over, and then one day, one of the members of the community goes up to smudge his face, but the Golem has become so big that as soon as he shuts off, he goes dormant, he collapses, killing this person.
Yeah, and before we continue with more Golem stories, I would just like to mention another very influential piece of work that appeared around this time. It's not exactly a Golem story, but it's by a guy you may have heard of, Goethe, really the father of modern German literature in many ways. He had this one particular short poem called Das Zauberlehrling, which is The Sorcerer's Apprentice. If you've watched Fantasia, you're familiar with the vague strokes of this one.
Yes.
It's really a short poem which tells the story of an apprentice who, in the absence of his master, uses enchantments to get a broom and a bucket to do his chores for him without his input. But he doesn't remember the word to deactivate them, so they just keep going, and even after he physically breaks them, and the house gets flooded. This only stops when the master reappears and he's there to stop the magic. And again, this is very much a moralistic parable that this apprentice, he was tampering with forces outside of his control, and this consequently brought about misfortune.
And I think it's a specifically Christian interpretation that playing God is something that's deeply evil, or at the very least, incredibly ill-advised.
It's not necessarily playing God as it is activating forces that you don't have strict control over, really. And I felt like this one is worth mentioning both because it would have very wide circulation and would inform the interpretation of the Golem stories, but also because a variant of the story appears in the later, more popular stories about the Golem of Prague, as we'll get to in a bit. But before we get to that, we have to ask ourselves, how did the Golem come to Prague specifically? Because in these stories, the context is very much Poland, whether it's specifically Rav Eliyahu or it's the Polish Jews writ large. This is not a Czech story. There's this one great paper that I consulted for this episode, written by Deckel and Gurley, titled How the Golem Came to Prague, which traces the genealogy of this legend. The earliest reference that they came across, specifically placing the story in Prague, was from 1834 in a work by a man named Seligman Kohn. But this was really an offhanded reference. The first elaboration in the context of Prague was written by a guy named Ludwig August Frankl, and was published in 1836 in the Viennese literary magazine in an issue of Vaterländische Sagen und Legenden, like sayings and legends of the fatherland. This was a time when the folkloristic tradition was in full swing, for reasons we'll get into in a bit. But let's look at Frankl's story. Franco is the first one to say that the golem remains in the attic of the Altneuschul Synagogue in Prague. And in this story, a certain Rabbi Lowe creates a golem to be a servant, but he would deactivate it before Shabbat by taking the paper with the secret name of God out of its mouth because, quote, even the damned spirits are permitted to rest on the Sabbath. But following the death of his son, the rabbi is so stricken with grief that he forgets to deactivate it, at which point it was, quote, seized as if by madness. His eyes rolled and burned like flaming wheels, and his breath was visible and sparked with wonderful colors. It goes on a rampage, but the rabbi is able to deactivate it by uttering a curse, and the rabbi never practiced this magic again, having learned his lesson.
I love the flaming wheels right there. It's very biblical.
Yeah, exactly. Like a very close variant of the story would again appear in 1837 in Auerbach's novel Spinoza, which we mentioned at the top of the episode. And this one is very much the same, except that the holy name is put in a slit in the golem's head. It's kind of like a token type deal. Yeah, but the version that really gained a mass following was written by Leopold Wiesel and was published in 1847 as part of a larger anthology of Jewish folklore. And this one is interesting both because this was an extremely popular book. It was in circulation in many editions for decades. And in this story, it's quite interesting because he explicitly references the sorcerer's apprentice in this one. Quote, to the rabbi, his golem was like the broom to the sorcerer's apprentice in Goethe's poem. But the man who has more than anything to do with the golem story as it's told today is a man named Udo Rosenberg. He really did more than anyone else to put the story within Prague and to attribute the acts to the Maharal, the Rabbi Lowe, Ben Bezalel, who in life wasn't a Kabbalistic figure at all, really. In fact, he wasn't fond of this kind of stuff. But he was really the ideal person to attribute this legend to because he's a man of great learning and he was greatly respected by Jews and Christians alike. This wasn't one of those weird Eastern mystics that people would have been turning their noses up at.
Yeah, and what I think is also especially important about Rosenberg is that he was writing in both Hebrew and Yiddish, specifically to a Jewish audience, including the more isolated, very religious communities of Russia and Poland. So I think that Rosenberg's work is probably more than anything the reason why this early modern 19th century German golem story started entering Eastern Jewish communities and then eventually spreading back into America and back into Germany through immigration.
Yeah, and Rosenberg is really an incredible figure. We have to get into his biography a bit just because there's a lot of stuff going on here. So he was born in Poland in 1860, which was then a part of the Russian Empire. But he became most famous when he moved over to Canada in 1913, and he would ultimately become the Grand Rabbi of Montreal. This guy, he was really a jack of all trades. He was involved in all kinds of stuff. To quote Kate Alinsky, who wrote a review of a recent biography of Rosenberg, he was, quote, the deeply learned but highly eccentric chief rabbi of Montreal, who moonlighted as a faith healer, magic amulet salesman, oracle, halachic innovator, Hasidic storyteller, and the most aggressively enterprising kosher chicken slaughterhouse supervisor in Canadian Jewish history. That's quite a resume he's got there. But today he's most remembered as a writer. He wrote several very popular books where the Maharal is a character. But the thing with Rosenberg is that he was a bit of a fabulist. He just liked to make stuff up. So a lot of these stories and books that he published, he attributed them to manuscripts which he transcribed by hand from the so-called Royal Library of Metz.
Yeah, but did he really? Probably not. This is just like, again, just like the folklorist adding over an embellishment. Here he is, pretending that this story is much older than it is.
Yeah, the real problem here, of course, is that no such library ever existed, period. But let's give you guys a taste of what this Rosenberg guy was about. First, we're going to go over his 1913 story, The Book of the High Priest's Breastplate, which was published in Hebrew in 1913. And this is purported to be a transcription of a first-hand account of the Maharal's 1590 visit to London to retrieve the breastplate of the priest from the Second Temple period, which was stolen from a museum by an unscrupulous thief. So he finds out who stole the item in question, and he curses the thief so that calamities befall him in his personal life, which are so great that he ultimately just returns the artifact free of charge to escape the curse that the rabbi had placed on him. It's an interesting story, I guess, but it's also plagiarized, for lack of a better word. It's basically a retelling of Arthur Conan Doyle's 1899 story called The Jew's Breastplate. Even the names of the characters involved, aside from the Maharal, are totally the same. Yeah, he was just passing this off as real wisdom transcribed by the Maharal himself.
That's really funny. So basically, what you're saying here then is that this is basically Arthur Conan Doyle was doing like an Orientalist, Christian misinterpretation of Judaism that is then accepted by this Jewish scholar himself and becomes an actual part of Jewish.
It's not really a misinterpretation of Judaism. In the Arthur Conan Doyle story, like the outlines are very much the same. Like this museum in London has this that has this artifact from the Second Temple period. It gets stolen, and something needs to be done to return it to its proper place. But this guy, he just took it, he translated it into Hebrew, and he passed it off as an actual historical event.
Wow, yeah.
In 1904 originally, and then 1909 in Hebrew, like the original was in Yiddish, he wrote The Golem and the Wondrous Deeds of the Maharal, which employs the same framing device as the Jew's breastplate. He says that it's a transcription of a manuscript from the same Royal Library of Metz, which, again, does not exist. And it's a first-hand account written by the Maharal's son-in-law, who was involved in all of these shenanigans. And it's basically a compilation of stories about the Maharal and his trusty golem sidekick. It's very Pulp Fiction-y, but it would ultimately be the source of much of the Golem lore after Rosenberg's work was itself plagiarized by a guy named Chaim Bloch, who translated into German proper. And in this story, Prague is a place where the Jews are under constant threat of pogroms and blood libel. Like, it seems like just about every week there's some nefarious anti-Semite scheming to plant a body in the Jewish quarter to implicate the Jewish community in blood libel. So in 1580, as the novel tells it, the Maharal has a dream where he's told to construct a golem to defend his community. And here's how the process is described by Rosenberg. Quote, "There on the clay bank, we measured out a man 3 cubits long, and we drew his face in the earth, and his arms and legs, the way a man lies on his back. Then all 3 of us stood at the feet of the reclining golem, with our faces to his face, and the rabbi commanded me to circle the golem 7 times from the right side of his head, from the head to the left side, and then back to his feet. And he told me the formula to speak as I circled the golem 7 times. And when I had done the rabbi's bidding, the golem turned red as fire. Next, the rabbi commanded his pupil, Jacob Sassoon, to do the same as I had done, but he revealed different formulas to him. This time the fiery red was extinguished, and a vapor arose from the supine figure, which had grown nails and hair. Now the rabbi walked around the golem 7 times with the Torah scrolls, like a circular procession in the synagogue at New Year's. And then, in conclusion, all 3 of us together recited the verse, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the earth, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And in this way, the golem comes into the world." In this story, the golem, he has a name, actually. He's called a Yosele, which is Little Joseph. And he's mute, but he's actually quite smart for the most part, although he doesn't quite understand what people ask of him. In one of the episodes, drawing from the Zauberlehrling, the rabbi's wife asks the golem to fill up a tub, but he doesn't understand that when it's full, he should stop pouring it. So the tub starts overflowing and there's flooding. And and then the rabbi shows up and he puts an end to this. But
it's very cute. This seems like the most kind of like cartoonish interpretation.
Yeah, but nevertheless, he's a nice guy. And in fact, he's very clever. Going back to the Arthur Conan Doyle connection, The Golem basically works as a detective in many of these stories. Yosele, he's mostly reliable when it comes to serious matters. He defeats many people who hope to blame the Jews for blood libel. There's an anti-Semitic priest who just keeps setting up all these plots. There's a bunch of disgruntled Gentile workers in the Jewish-owned workshop who try to blame the Jews for the death of their brother who stole from his owner and then died of natural causes. But thanks to the Golem, the Jews of Prague and the Maharal are able to outmaneuver people who would see them destroyed. And finally, at the story's conclusion, the Maharal is able to get an audience with the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Rudolf II, and receives an assurance that the Jews would never be hurt by blood libel accusations again. So at this point, the Golem is deactivated to dream his dreamless sleep, and it remains in the attic of the synagogue to this day. Like I said, it's a children's story for the most part. One interpretation I've read that tries to paint Rosenberg in a better light says that he was basically trying to create a Jewish alternative for the kinds of popular fiction which were circulating at the time. He wanted Jewish kids to remain Jewish, so he created all of these stories that basically adapt Gentile stories in a much more Jewish light.
Yeah, and this reminds me of, it's like many centuries earlier, there were Hebrew and Yiddish versions of Christian romances, like King Arthur, and published in like 1400. So this seems like the same kind of idea.
Exactly. But unfortunately for the Jews of the Austrian Empire, writ large, the measures that supposedly passed by Rudolf II would not hold. In fact, in 1899, there was the Hilsner affair, which was just a straight-up old-style blood libel blaming a Jewish man for the murder of a bunch of Christian women as part of ritualistic sacrifices.
Yeah, and I'd never heard of this. And this is so crazy because it's like, this is a straight up medieval blood libel. It's like William of Norwich, this made up ritualistic killing in 1899. And it wasn't even in like the most isolated of places. It happened in Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, so what had happened is that in 1899, 19-year-old Maneshka Khrushcheva was murdered, and the murder was pinned on a Jewish vagrant named Leopold Hilsner. So once they have this guy in custody, they try to pin another unsolved murder case on him. Another woman named Marie Klimova, who died the previous year. So the accusation was that he had murdered these two women as part of a ritual sacrifice for Passover specifically. Hilsner would be defended by Masaryk, who would later become the first president of Czechoslovakia, but he was still sentenced to execution despite this. Although the sentence was ultimately commuted by the Kaiser, Hilsner would remain in jail until 1918. This was a time when you had the Dreyfus Affair, you had the Hilsner Affair, all of these stories of scapegoating of Jews were circulating. So in this context, it makes a lot of sense why Rosenberg would have interpolated 16th century Prague to be this place where the Jews were under constant threat of blood libel accusations.
Yeah, and if I could even psychologize a little bit more, it's really easy to see in this context why the idea of this magical protector of the Jews might be attractive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that kind of brings us to the next question, basically, which is, why is the Golem figure so enduringly popular, especially after Rosenberg's writing, especially into the 20th century?
Yeah, but first let's wrap up the Rosenberg story real quick. He's a really fun figure, vast record, very eccentric, very sure of himself, so much so that he even did his own redaction of the Zohar, which is like the most important Kabbalistic text. He basically rearranged the material to put it in the correct order as it was actually supposed to be written. But the problem was that he once again relied on materials from this royal library in Metz. He would continue his antics for the rest of his days. He was involved in a lot of stuff, as I mentioned previously. He was very involved in community affairs. As a very influential rabbi in Montreal, he supported labor union organizing for a 5-day week specifically so Jews could have the Sabbath off.
Nice.
And he was also very accommodating to modern life, for example, allowing Canadian Jews to use electricity on the Sabbath, which is something that brought him a lot of ire from more traditional figures who chided him for allowing his congregation to turn away from God by breaking these commandments. But really, he was just realistic in this regard. He was saying that although in Eastern Europe, where there's no electricity, or in Palestine, where electrification has not yet happened, it's not an issue for a person not to use electricity on the Sabbath. But in my context, if I were to not be accommodating, then people would turn away from Judaism altogether. So that would be a much greater loss in the end. So yeah, very pragmatic guy, very colorful figure. Now let's continue our Golem saga specifically and talk a bit about what it was about this figure from the Talmud and later Kabbalistic interpretations of Jewish theology that would make him so appealing to audiences writ large, both Jew and Gentile, in the 19th century. And the way I read this is that it's the result of a confluence of many factors which have to do with the dynamics of early 19th century Europe writ large. And there was also an element specific to the Jewish community, to German-speaking Jewish communities, who had largely assimilated into the Gentile milieu, but who nevertheless faced stringent legal problems because legal equality for Jews was not reattained for a while after the post-Napoleonic reactionary rollback. As Deckel and Gurley put it, quote, "The Golem had become folded into a larger set of romantic motifs that included the doppelganger, galvanization, Faustian sorcery, and various automata, including, most famously, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's monster." So, so what is this? So what are these romantic motifs that Deckel and Gurley mention? Let's venture into Romanticism, the movement of the early 19th century, which was all the rage back then.
Right, because the Golem story really starts to reach critical mass at a time when Romanticism is really in full swing, because this is a time of just enormous social change in Europe and the broader world. The Industrial Revolution was well underway, and there were all these new anxieties about modern man losing touch with nature and all of the many social ties that had existed previously. There was a fear that, starting in the 19th century, we might be losing our connection to humanity itself. There's a really good Percy Shelley quote here. It's funny, both of the Shelleys come up in this episode. It's kind of interesting. This is from 1813 in his poem Queen Mab, when he writes, "The man of virtuous soul commands not nor obeys. Power, like a desolating pestilence, pollutes whate'er it touches, and obedience, bane of all genius, virtue, freedom, truth, makes slaves of men, and of the human frame a mechanized automaton."
Yeah, this was something that was remarked upon by people of all kinds of different political tendencies at this time. The arch-reactionary Thomas Carlyle has a famous essay, Signs of the Times, written in 1829, which begins in this way, quote, "Were we required to characterize this age of ours by any single epithet, we should be tempted to call it not an historical, devotional, philosophical, or moral age, but above all others, the mechanical age. It is the age of machinery in every sense of the word. Not the external and physical alone is now managed by the machinery, but the internal and spiritual as well. The same habit regulates not our modes of action alone, but our modes of thought and feeling. Men have grown mechanical in heart and head, as well as in hand. They have lost faith in individual endeavors and in natural forces of any kind, not for internal perfection, but for external combinations and arrangements, for institutions, constitutions, for mechanism of one sort or another, do they hope and struggle." But such views weren't exclusive to the domain of conservatives or reactionaries who just wanted to return, as the meme goes. Even Marx would have writings to this effect.
Yes, here's a quote by our man Marx, where he says, "Political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor by not considering the direct relationship between the worker and production. It is true that labor produces for the rich wonderful things, but for the worker it produces privation. It produces palaces, but for the worker, hovels. It produces beauty, but for the worker, deformity. It replaces labor by machines, but it throws one section of the workers into barbarous types of labor, and it turns the other section into a machine. It produces intelligence, but for the worker, stupidity and cretinism."
Yeah, that's from the manuscripts of 1844, Which just goes to show it was a real problem, and people were begging for a solution. And this wasn't just the domain of heady intellectuals who had too much time on their hands, as some critics are wont to say of this kind of talk. Let's not forget about the Luddites and other similar manifestations which were happening all across Europe. Now, Luddite is an interesting term because today it's associated with people who are afraid of technology writ large because they hate the engine of progress, so the story goes. And it's really unfortunate that this is the way that people choose to interpret Luddism because it really obscures what was happening in this time. So the designation began in 1811 when workers in Nottingham, who were working more hours than ever for poorer wages, and had to deal with rising inflation costs because of the war efforts happening, at this time, they staged a protest which demanded better pay and working conditions for themselves. When this protest was broken up by soldiers, they began to smash weaving equipment. This phenomenon would then rapidly spread across England for several years, to the point that Parliament even passed laws instituting the death penalty for those involved. And the reason why these people were called Luddites was because because it was attributed to this guy named Ned Ludd, who supposedly in 1789 got angry because he got whipped by his masters and he broke up some weaving machines. So whenever crowds would come in and destroy these factories, or the machines in them at the very least, people would start sarcastically saying that Ned Ludd did it. And some of the elites actually began to believe that Ludd was a real leader of these protests. One particularly apt comparison that I can think of is like whenever a mass shooting or a terrorist attack of some kind happens, people are now always saying that Sam Hyde did it.
Yeah, that like tired meme. Yeah. It's weird. It's kind of a funny, it's funnily similar process. Yeah.
And despite the way that this tends to be framed, that these workers were just doing wanton destruction because in their souls they were savages and whatnot, and they just weren't happy that their traditions were being torn away from them. This was like the issue wasn't really the technology itself, but rather the fact that technology in the hands of the emergent bourgeoisie was immiserating workers more than ever. There were greater outputs for less money happening all the time, and this meant that workers' wages were shrinking, and it also meant the destruction of artisans who made a living by their own labor and their own hand, who were suddenly flung into the ranks of the proletariat. And this further compounded the problem by the fact that these people who were previously self-sufficient were now part of the expanding reserve army of labor. And many contemporary people commented on these manifestations at the time, but my favorite that I've come across was by Lord Byron, who gave the following parliamentary address in 1812.
But whilst these outrages must be admitted to exist to an alarming extent, it cannot be denied that they have arisen from circumstances of their most unparalleled distress. The perseverance of these miserable men in their proceedings tends to prove that nothing but absolute want could have driven a large and once honest and industrious body of people into the commission of excesses so hazardous to themselves, their family, and the community. I have been in some of the most oppressed provinces of Turkey, but never under the most despotic of infidel governments did I behold such squalid wretchedness as I have seen since my return, in the very heart of a Christian country.
Yeah, very, very strong words. And in fact, because of this romantic movement, there was, of course, the Golem, there was Frankenstein's monster, there was Goethe's broom, but there was really an entire body of literature and characters that would be spawned as a result of these ideas. One example would be the 1920 play Rostrom's Universal Robots, written by Czech playwright Karl Čapek, which in fact coined the term robot, which was, the literal mechanization of man. This mechanical creature who presumably wants not and who could just continue working to its master's content, really. Aside from the wider manifestations, there was also a very particular thing happening in the German context. As I mentioned, although the Jews of the German-speaking areas of Europe would would have legal equality taken away from them in the post-Napoleonic reaction, really, this didn't stop them from increasingly becoming Germanized and into becoming part of this German society. It's no coincidence that that a lot of the people who were recording these golem stories, people like Franco, like Auerbach, like Wiesel, were all Jews. This had to do with the fact that just as the Brothers Grimm went around collecting all of these stories because they feared that that the old world was going away and they wanted to create an archive of folk traditions, the Jews very much felt the same way. They saw that they were no longer living in the same conditions as their grandparents had, that they were increasingly becoming part of a larger society, and they were engaging in the same practices and getting the same kinds of education as their Gentile counterparts. So really, this was about preserving a kernel of authentic Jewish life as they saw it in the face of increasing encroachment of modern life, so that future generations would know the ways of their ancestors. This was also done in the context of the larger movement of the Wissenschaft für Judentum, which was a group of scholars which was suddenly applying modern methods of analysis to Jewish scripture and things of that nature.
And, I think that's going back to the broader idea of the mechanization of man. During this time, you also see this proletarianization of very religious Jewish communities in Eastern Europe and also in America. So you would have had these deeply religious people suddenly becoming industrial factory workers. And that must have been probably especially jarring from people from those communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Although this was much more prominent in the further east you went, because Jews in more western parts of Europe tended to be more urban for the most part. So they would have been familiar with the way that things were run.
Yeah, but I think if people like Kaganovich, the Soviet leader, I believe that he was from an Orthodox Jewish background, but he was a factory worker. So he would have been he would have been a first generation proletarian, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Like previously, the shtetl would make way for the the shtetl and the yeshiva would make way for the factory and the modern school, really. So it was just a time of massive changes. It's really hard for us to fathom it. Like I've seen a comparison made before that, like, if you were to take a person living in 1820 to 1920, the world that they would see would be totally different from the world that they themselves inhabited. But if you were to take a person from 1920 and take them to around 2020, our time, although it's quite different in many ways, we have cell phones, there's television, things of that nature. But nevertheless, the change just isn't as jarring to go from living in these tiny villages of 100 people to living in mega cities with skyscrapers and public transportation to now, which is just a further development of that same phenomenon. It's not the same. It's hard to fathom.
Right. We were just speaking about this broader idea of, the sudden transformations of the 19th to 20th century, the beginning of this industrial economy, this enormous social change. I think the biggest change of the 19th century really came to a head in the 20th century with the start of the World Wars, just completely transforming life in Europe as people knew it. And this kind of brings us, I think, to the last point of this episode, which is the fact that it's really important to consider the way that the Golem in this movie from 1920 and broader perceptions of Golem mythology tie into the cultural memory of the World Wars, both among Jews and among Gentiles.
So starting in the 1920s, both Jewish and Gentile writers would use the Golem to illustrate the inhuman characteristics of modern society. This reliance of machine over man, this reliance on the machine at the expense of man, and on machines and social systems which were depersonalized, which would one day be able to destroy those who created them. And with the World Wars, there was suddenly this image of the Golem as basically the ultimate super soldier who doesn't think but just acts. There was suddenly this renewed interest in this idea. Maya Barzilai argues that, quote, the mute monster became a means to reflect on how battlefield technologies had altered human lives. There was a very popular cartoon around this time by American Marxist artist Paul Miner, which depicted the ideal soldier in the minds of the capitalist warmongers. He was this giant, hulking, unthinking servant, not at all unlike the Golem in Paul Wegener's movies.
Yeah.
Paul Wegener himself, as we mentioned at the top of the episode, served in the First World War between the production of the first Golem movie and subsequent ones. When the original 1915 was being screened, it would often be preceded by newsreels from the front showing the people back at home how the war was going. And so a lot of people were commenting on just how jarring it was that through the power of cinema, Paul Wegener could simultaneously be fighting for the fatherland as well as appearing on the screen to entertain the audiences.
Yeah, and we should mention that he was doing real fighting. Wegener wasn't like just part of some film crew out on the front. He was in the trenches quite literally, and he was in a squad of 49 men, and out of that squad, only 4 of them, including him, would survive, which is crazy. He only really got away because he had some kind of sickness or injury which got him an honorable discharge. And when he got back to Germany, he was given the famous Iron Cross. That's, how serious his efforts were. So after he gets this award, he's immediately celebrated as a hero, but here's the interesting thing here. Like so many other veterans of World War I, Wegener started the war as this proud German or French or British patriot, and then left the war totally disillusioned with nationalism, because he had seen the absolute horrors this kind of ideology can bring to people. Barzilai even argues that because of that, you can interpret the third Golem movie You can even interpret the third Golem movie, the one that we talked about in this episode, as essentially a veiled anti-war film. Remember, it was produced by the state-funded film company. It had some involvement from people like Ludendorff, these major German generals. So even though it was now the Weimar era, the message was kind of smuggled in. But she argues that, just like in that comic by Paul Miner, the Golem is presented as this unthinking creature made to destroy. At the beginning of the movie, when they first summon him, he only does these household tasks. But then by the end of it, people like Lowe's assistant have him do darker tasks, like including killing the Squire Florian.
Yeah, one can even compare the role of the demon Masteroth in this movie to the nationalist fervor that compelled ordinary people in Germany as much as in France and in Britain to fight and kill each other for what ends exactly. So by the end of the movie, the Golem has a chance to experience this brief moment of humanity and to save the Jews of Prague. Barzilai believes that the Golem sees the little girl at the end of the movie and becomes alive, truly alive for one fleeting moment until his life is torn from him. Yeah, so this Golem mythology, it would develop as time went on. We just never really stopped thinking about the Golem. We got golems on the mind. So during World War II and in its immediate aftermath, the Golem was really used to represent the blindly loyal German soldiers who were committing these terrible atrocities on scale, which was hard to fathom before without giving it a second thought. And it was because of this that during World War II, while all these guys were in exile in Hollywood, Paul Falkenberg, who was the editor to Fritz Lang's M, which again we talked about in episode 38, and Henry Galeen developed a script in which the Jews of the ghetto created a golem to combat the Nazis. Unfortunately, this movie was never made because of the sort of anti-Semitism that was happening in Hollywood at the time. We talked about how in the Casablanca episode, they took special care not to include any explicitly Jewish characters just because it was felt that people wouldn't react well to seeing explicit Jews on screen. So rather than that, it was much better to lean on these generic anti-Nazi tropes rather than to make an explicitly Jewish case for doing something about the Nazis. Because again, popular sentiment at the time was that basically this war was none of America's business, that we should just stay over here and mind our business. At the same time, and in fact, directly after the war, there was even one legend that was recorded, which told the story of how during the occupation of Prague, some Nazis had gone up into the attic of the Altneuschul Synagogue to see if the golem really was there, and they never returned. No one ever saw them again. So
spooky.
Yeah, so these kinds of stories, they were really, it was the zeitgeist. So much so that early that Zionist writers of this period even imagined the golem in many different ways, although previous Zionists would not really like the golem because they considered it a sign of the diaspora and not something that the new Jewish culture that they were creating in Palestine should be mimicking. Later Israeli writers would make use of the golem sympathetically as the wounded soldier. And in fact, there was even this one journalist writing in the 40s, I believe, that Barzilai picked up on in her book, who says that, who speculated that one day robotic so-called golems could be used to fight wars from afar. He was basically imagining drone warfare.
Right. And that's like the kind of a big thread of this episode, how if we're seeing the golem as this manifestation of mechanization, then the golems are everywhere now. The golem won. This is the world that we live in today. And I think that this movie is so cool because Paul Wegener, as early as 1920, had his finger on the pulse with that.
Yeah. And in fact, some people would draw a very explicit connection to the kinds of stuff that we see around us today. In fact, you're basically listening to this episode on a golem right now. And some people were aware of this. So Gershom Scholem, the Jewish scholar that we quoted before in this episode, in the 60s, proposed that the first computer at an Israeli university should be called Golem Aleph, like Golem A. Mm-hmm. And this association of the golem with computers writ large, it's something that continues to this day. Yeah, during the Cold War, when the threat of nuclear apocalypse was hanging over our heads, the Jewish American writer Isaac Bashevis Singer saw the golem in nuclear weapons. It was a weapon that was so powerful that it would potentially destroy not just its creators, but the entire world in the end. And he hoped that one day, just like the Golem of Prague, we'd be able to destroy this terrible weapon and to banish it to the realm of fiction and folklore.
Yeah, I think it's kind of compelling. Like, this is, an enormous question, Sam, but what do you think it would be possible to eventually, what words can we speak to destroy these modern day golems, do you think?
I mean, we don't have the levers on the power, unfortunately.
Well, I'm just speaking, humanity at large. If all humans are Rabbi Lowe in this metaphor, can the toothpaste of, mechanized warfare ever be put back into the tube? Or are we going to be living in the age of golems forever?
Well, in times like this, I remember Einstein's quote where he said that he did not know which weapons would be used to fight World War III, but that World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah, it's the classic one.
Ultimately, I don't know, it sounds really very frightening to think about, especially now at a time when the nuclear threat is more real to us than ever, to consider what could possibly be next. I don't know what to tell you. I don't. I'm sorry. This is something that everyone has to come to terms with by themselves, unfortunately. But yeah, aside from golem as nuclear weapons, there's a thriving golem. The golem, even if he's not called by that name, continues to persist in our culture today. Like, for example, the Blade Runner movies, basically the people that they're dealing with are basically modern day golems. No?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely, yeah. It's a very similar concept. We talked about the links with Frankenstein, but really every robot story owes a debt to this golem myth to some extent. Whether you're talking about Philip K. Dick or The Matrix, even. The idea of these simulacrums of human life that aren't quite there.
Yeah, and of course the golem par excellence would be The Matrix or Skynet. Basically, that's the ultimate nightmare here, really. That
you mean the Terminator? But yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that not only would these creatures destroy us, they would decide to one day replace us. And it's a compelling fantasy, I'd say, for the reasons we enumerated above. It has a very long history for good reason, I would say. And unfortunately, we happen to be living at a time when what was previously fiction is increasingly entering the domain of real life. Just a couple of examples off the top of my head. In 2018, there was the famous assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists who were, as I understood it, killed remotely by an autonomous weapon that was connected to a satellite or something like that. I don't remember the details. But the more vivid example happened, in fact, just last year, really, when Turkey used the first fully autonomous drones to kill someone in Libya without human input, period. We're increasingly seeing all these videos of like the Boston Dynamic dogs. I saw one that showed one of these dogs with a machine gun attached to it. Of course, Elon Musk is now getting into the robot business. Just a couple of months ago, he unveiled his shitty little robot which can barely walk to a crowd of cheering sycophants. That one I'm less worried about just because it seems goofy for now. But hey, you never know. Increasingly, we live in a world where the golem is not only something that... We live in a world of golems, which we not only rely on, but which one day may dominate us.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, which makes that, and I think that is what we were talking about. We opened this episode by asking, is the golem scary? And I think that you, Russian Sam, have figured out that, yes, in a sense it is. It might not be the kind of horror movie that, makes you jump out of your seat in fright, but it is the kind of horror movie that makes you think and makes you feel kind of bad about the nature of our society and what this might represent.
Yeah, well, on that happy note, this has been... thank you so much for tuning in, all of you. I hope you gained something.
Yes, this is a really interesting one. Yeah, and again, thank you so much, Russian Sam, for doing amazing research again.
Thank you also for your amazing input to the script for this episode. We couldn't have done it without you. And thank you, the listener, for listening to us. And thank you, golems out there, for making this episode available to our listeners.
Yes, this has been Gladio Free Europe, signing off.
Have a happy Halloween. Goodbye.